is really powerful. I can't remember if I shared it in the webinar, but on about I think it was the end of the first or second week of March, a former client of ours, but also a mate of mine, phoned us up and he said, look, I just want to tell you that the work we did a couple of years ago to get my team thinking in this way, we started our pandemic preparedness in early January. As soon as we saw what was happening in China, we thought this could get out in the world. And we were organized, ready to work remotely, all that sort of stuff well ahead of when we actually needed to do it. So when the time came, shift done. Oh, and by the way, we've just discovered that maybe we don't need to be paying for expensive real estate on Collins Street in Melbourne anymore, because people are happy, they're healthy, they're working from home, and it might create a new set of opportunities. That's investment we could spend differently. It's just being able to see it and move quickly. It becomes really powerful.
And David, I think it's something that relates back to what you were talking before. It's about knowing my preferred way of thinking and others' preferred ways of thinking and trying to find how to communicate backwards and forwards. So if somebody's preferred way of thinking is to be linear, and I'm going, well, there's this system and everything's going to change, and they go, yeah, right, okay, off you go.
Yeah. So we got, it's a great segue to the next little question here, which is, so then when we get to sort of an organizational scale, or dare I say it, across a community, why do you think having a shared view of conditions becomes more important or becomes powerful?
My initial response to this, David, is around the empathy that it gives, and an opportunity to understand that while we might all be experiencing the same conditions, it affects us differently.
Yeah, that's really important, and to be tuned into that for sure. What else?
We did some work with Australian Pork last year where we wrote scenarios to do their strategic thinking, and one of the scenarios was that the swine flu jumped from pigs and created a global pandemic. And then we did some ideation and thinking around that with stakeholders and the actual producers right across Australia, and developed thinking and planning around what you might do under those circumstances, which has now been enacted. And so they have a common language, they have a common understanding, but it also generated a whole range of different ideas, all of which were valid and could be applied depending upon those conditions and contexts.
Yeah. Great points, right? So what I heard in there, which is really powerful, is it's people having a shared context for making decisions. And I've said that before, but to really bring that to life, opening up to different possibilities because you're tapping into different brains out of that shared context, and then having a framework and a language that people can use is really powerful. The last thing I would add to that, we think it really does is that's where you get strategic agility. Agility comes from an ability to move quickly, right? Now, doing that as a single person or as a sole trader or whatever, not that difficult because you don't have to bring the masses with you. But if bringing the masses with you comes out of we already understand what's going on and we're watching collectively for what might come next, taking a sharp right turn is not that difficult to do. So when organizations talk about, strategic agility being important, we're not too sure how you do that without a good understanding of conditions, because otherwise you have to spend time getting people aligned to what's the decision we need to make. Otherwise, the decisions should already, exactly as you've said, the decisions are almost there, just waiting to be taken if the conditions are right. And then just the last one for a bit of discussion. What do you think? We've already raised some of this, but what do you think might get in the way of creating that shared view?
I think fear could.
Yep.
People just don't want to know, so they will not engage.
Absolutely. Yeah. So fear, uncertainty. What else?
I think. Sorry.
It's about when you have that conversation. If you're having that conversation just in the middle of disruption, all the natural communities, I remember seeing a post on a bushfire presentation where all the natural communities fall apart into little pockets.
Yep.
If in that mixed, complete disrupted environment you try to have this conversation, it's too late.
Yeah.
So what's really important is the time when you have it.
Yeah. So what we think about that is when people or communities are disoriented, it's really not because they're in the middle of disruption. It's very hard to reorient them to a common view of what's going on. So that definitely gets in the way. We mentioned before bias. Bias can very definitely get in the way. Echo chambers, looking only for the theme, the patterns and the information that reinforces what we're already seeing. That can get in the way.
I think what I see at the moment is a reluctance to hear hard news. So a lack of kind of really critical voices in the room. So this real kind of toxic positivity, everything's awesome, we're all going to be great, which isn't helpful either, because it's a bit almost like the thumbs up, likes and dislikes. Everybody in the room is going thumbs up, it'll be fine, and it's not. And so I find that actually that culture particularly strong at the moment in some of the interactions that I'm having.
Yeah, I hear that very clearly. It's part of the reason and all of this is in the context of, we're hoping that you'll all go away and do some conditions analysis work with your teams or with your colleagues. And some of these are tips and cues for what might get in the way so we can watch for it beforehand. The other thing we do find is once you explain to people quite simply that you think about it like you think about the weather and speak to the conditions as simply what is, it does deal with a lot of the positivity and the negativity, because it's not about your perception. It's not about the person that sits behind it. It's just, this is reality. So let's get aligned to that. If it's raining, it's raining. If you choose to go outside in the rain without an umbrella, you're going to get wet. That's just the way it works. So let's get clear-eyed about what's going on so we can make better decisions. Now, Jess, just quickly, for some reason, my Zoom isn't cooperating as much as I would like it to. So I noticed some chats were coming through, but it won't let me see them.
It's okay. I'll monitor the chats if you like, because I'm getting them coming up. So a number of people, Guy and Stephen and others, were talking about one of the things that gets in the way is there's so much information around. How do you separate the fact from fiction? And Guy summarised it by saying it's the quality of evidence.
It is. It is the quality of evidence when it comes to what we know we know. It's also the ability to work into emerging conditions where we have to trust some level of insight. I'm doing a project at the moment with the National Network of Optometrists, and optometrists, like a lot of specialized health professionals, really work in a risk-averse sort of mindset and need, very clear evidence to support decision-making. And I was trying to explain the balance around that, and the metaphor that I worked with them on a little bit is the idea: if you took your family on a picnic to a park, and the park had a pond in it, your brain would very quickly make sense of that set of conditions because it's a familiar pattern, you know what it means, and you assess opportunity and risk. Now, if you've got small children and there's a pond, there's a very real risk around those kids potentially going into the pond, all that sort of stuff. Now, you could do an analysis on that and find out that in the 100 years prior, no child had ever fallen into that pond and drowned. Right? That's important data, but does it change your view of the risks to your immediate circumstance? Not at all, because you're not going to go, well, nobody's drowned here yet, so I won't pay any attention to my kids and they won't drown either. You still deal with the very real opportunity and risk as you make sense of the conditions. So one of the challenges is, you've got to be rigorous around your evidence, but also understand what evidence is required to make the best decision you can, knowing that as we push further into this new normal, some of the evidence from the past becomes less informative about where we might go. And that's a tricky balance. And what we find is that the part of the way you resolve that is by having those active and robust conversations to get to a clear view of what do we really need to understand to move forward.
And a couple more comments have come up about the role of trust, Guy, and also the role of laziness. That was Laura.
Yes. Yeah, we don't particularly like to be pushed if we don't have to be. There's no question. I can make strategy and action sound very simple. And when you use the dancing example, you watch someone who's a beautiful dancer and it looks so easy, right? And you forget how much work goes into being an amazing dancer, right? The rigor and the discipline and all that sort of stuff. And it's the same thing. We can be a bit lazy, and that's not helpful in this environment. And it's a very challenging space now to be playing forward into, and I think about, say, I know a number of folks here from universities, and I've been in more than I'd care to remember meetings around, units and courses for the future. And very rarely are they pushing out into let's create the units and courses that are going to bring people into the future, because there's no data to say that there's demand for that, and there's a risk to take. We might not get enough students to make it a viable course. We might not understand how to sell it. The market might not value it yet. All that stuff is there. But if we're going to be bold in going forward into an uncertain world, we're going to have to learn how to balance those up and find, space to take some risks, not as a roll of the dice, but as best you can, calculated understanding of where we could go next, getting there quickly to then take it further.
And if we're taking people with us, Guy mentioned trust before, and then Adam put his finger on it. It's about not just talking, but listening.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And listening to the not the usual voices. Right? I keep saying this to the optometrists. A third of their membership are what they call early career optometrists. If I really was serious about the future of my profession, I'd be getting out of the way and letting that group of people think about what's the world they want to create for themselves, right? So really, not as a token thing, we've got one young person on the board, isn't that fantastic? But really giving power to new voices, understanding that the most important thing to systems resilience is diversity. So why should we have diversity? Well, there's lots of reasons why we should have diversity, but in our view, you have diversity because it helps you be more resilient. So to put aside all the inequity to a certain extent we've had so far, the best reason for diversity going forward is to create better opportunities for all of us going forward. If we choose to ignore some of those simple lessons, then we set ourselves up potentially to repeat the mistakes of the past rather than creating a preferred future for ourselves. Any other sort of comments, questions before we kick off a little practice conditions conversation that you can then take away?
All quiet on the chat.
Okay. So we call this a baseline, or sometimes an initiating conditions analysis. So the point is to do a level of work with the required amount of rigor to create a baseline view that you can then take forward, right? So the early bits of conditions analysis take a bit more time. They're a bit harder. There's a bit more wrestling around with what's the data that we really need to understand to take it forward. But once you've done that, if you keep the view up to date, you don't have to keep going back and doing it again. All you have to do is take forward what else do we need to understand now, and what can we stop paying attention to because it really is not relevant anymore. So having a baseline view becomes very powerful. As I've said before, it's just when we have this conversation that we'll have in a sec as a practice, it's just the what is. So as best you can, just reporting conditions as they are. And then going back and saying, well, look, that sounds like it's a bit biased. Can we language that condition in a different way? We've got to remember that some are immediate, so that's what's relating to what's happening in the present and are the sort of known knowns, if you like, and then some are emergent, so they're coming into being. We talk very specifically, we're not, we really encourage people to adapt the base thinking to what works in their organization, but there are some concepts that we're a bit rigorous around. Immediate and emergent is one of them. We don't talk about current and future because that sounds like there's a predictable timescale. Emergence is timing based. It's not time scale based. So if something's